Hello and welcome to the Leaders in Cleantech podcast. I'm David Hunt, CEO and founder of Hyperion Executive Search and your host for the Leaders in Cleantech podcast. Now, Josh Rogan's quite well known for dropping F-bombs on his podcast, which we may or may not do today, but we'll be definitely dropping some A-bombs. And that's nothing to do with Oppenheimer. And we'll explain a little bit more in a moment. So firstly, let me introduce our guest today, who is a cleantech entrepreneur, investor, and advisor, Ulrich Seitz. Ulrich, great to have you on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you. Great to be here.
So before we start dropping those A-bombs, it might be useful for us to share a little bit of your cleantech journey, what it is that you've done in your past that brings you up to this point now in your career.
First, I came in touch with the topic of cleantech around 2009, a year before my graduation from university. Together with a couple of physicists and material scientists, we founded a company called Crystal N. The purpose of that company back then was to enable the disinfection of water and air with ultraviolet LEDs.
Right.
At that time, water was a big thing in clean tech. Somehow it has almost vanished up to today. I did run that company for about 5 years. Back then we were the technological superior solution, but we lost the battle for the preferred solution in the industry. And finally had to sell the assets and liquidate the company. So right. I learned quite a lot from that experience.
Sure.
And after that, I was mostly active as a kind of hands-on and advisor and investor in early stage venture companies, and then got the chance to set up a corporate venture capital firm for BayWa, which is a large German multinational company active in the areas of energy and agriculture. And I run this climate tech VC for about 6 years until this year, July, and I'm still on board there as an advisor for the next months to come.
And planning future activities. But it's great to have that balance of both the entrepreneurial startup success and failure, which we learn as much from the latter as the former, and of course a successful period of time with BayWa Ventures. So it's good for you to join. So in terms of the conversation, Ulrich, we obviously meet from time to time at various trade events, and we talked for a number of times about why nobody or very few people are addressing a topic which seems to be taboo, which is that of adaptation, right? And I'm keen to explore that a little bit more with you. But I thought it might be just useful for context, because whilst not many people are talking about climate adaptations, the UN are, and I just wanted to share a couple of thoughts from their website, what they say about it, and then we can dig into your thoughts and the discussion about why it might be such a sort of a rare topic, so to speak. So the UN says that climate change is here. Beyond doing everything we can to cut emissions and slow the pace of global warming, we must adapt to climate consequences so we can protect ourselves and our communities. Given the scale of climate change and the fact that it will affect many areas of life, adaptation needs also to take place on a greater scale. There's much more around that. But so let's dig into that first a little bit, Ulrich, as to why you think that the term and the concept of climate adaptation is so rarely discussed in the entrepreneurial and investor communities in clean tech.
I think people are almost scared to think about that. That's why it's an almost irrelevant topic in the industry at the moment. Mm-hmm. It is like if you think about climate adaptation, you admit that all of your activities and potentially our global activities to reduce CO2 emissions and to suck out CO2 of the air to stop climate change have failed. I think that is the problem here. We didn't stop it, and we won't stop it in the near future. Climate change is already happening, so we need to kind of face reality here. Yeah. And that is simply frightening.
I think it's a good point, because from being in the sector like yourself back into the late sort of 2000s, there's such passion and optimism for achieving a net zero, to achieving a sustainable society through technology. And of course, so much has happened in that period of time to affect that, or to at least contribute to that. But like you say, it almost feels like an admission of failure to start saying, well, actually, we do need to adapt to some of what's already and about to happen, as well as still continue to fight the bigger battle?
Absolutely. Yes, it's absolutely necessary to do both. I don't say that we should stop our CO2 reduction investments. Absolutely not. They're 100% crucial and vital. But what we are doing here to a big part is we are buying time. We slow down climate change and we may also reduce it. But what do we do with that time? It's essential that we use that time, to adapt to the changing environment.
Yeah. Do you think there's an element of a perception that if we do divert some resources, financial resources, talent resources towards adaptation, that we take our eye off of the bigger battle that we've all been fighting for these years? And is that something which gives people either a fear or even just a reluctance to start to look at this topic of adaptation?
Yes, I think so. It's so this whole battleground gets way more complex and way more complicated if you have an eye also on the other side of the coin, that climate adaptation coin side. And it's also a different kind of problem to solve. So the world of cleantech investors got kind of simple. We have agreed on a enemy. It's CO2, and we pick or try to pick the best companies to reduce emissions and to get us closer to net zero. But with climate adaptation is a way more complex field, and the problems are more difficult to assess, and they are more diverse.
Yeah. Do you think that is part of the problem? Because it is, as you say, as much as, of course, reduction of CO2 or getting to a net zero economy is challenging. As you say, you've got one enemy and you have one area of focus, and multiple technologies can support that. But with adaptation, there's a lot of unknowns as to where and how the impacts will be most keenly felt. And that's potentially why that the complexity is also putting people off.
Yes, absolutely. And one big question in that field is also, to what shall we adapt? So when scientists talk about climate change and they make predictions about the future, usually they talk in scenarios which are kind of linked to the increase in temperatures globally.
Yeah.
So we do not really know for what scenario are we preparing for. But I would like to ask a question back. Do we really need that? Or do we already have problems which we can solve?
Yeah.
And I think that is the case. There is enough to do today. There are enough problems, and there are enough opportunities for investors.
Yeah.
But this whole theme, climate adaptation, is just not part, or is not seen in the climate tech investor scene.
Yeah. Do you think there might be an element, Ulrich, because from time to time, you may have heard the same, but from time to time I get the question, is it right that people should financially benefit from addressing climate change through the work that we do and the clients that we have who are creating and scaling these technologies? Is it even more the case that potentially there's a question mark as to whether we should be making money from adaptation, because it so directly affects people, and obviously with flooding situations, etc. Is it more of a moral question as to whether we should be making money from these adaptation technologies?
Yeah. So the question is it morally okay to financially benefit from the suffering of other people?
Indeed.
And I think there are. I mean, I don't know how to answer that, but I would like to. I'm not an idealist here. I think about how and on what we can create the biggest impact, and I think we should utilize the capitalistic system in a way that it's possible to support and make money at the same time. I don't know if that is always possible in all areas, but one could also argue that supporting people in poor, rural, and hot areas is an investment, as it might prevent people from migrating. There's definitely it's a complicating thing. Yeah. Essentially, I believe if you want to have a big impact, it's smart to use the capitalistic system for it. Governments are important as they might need to give the right incentives for business models to work in the right direction.
Yeah. I think it's a little bit of a misnomer of a question, because if you look back through history, you know, everything from the creation of sewers to the creation of vaccines to the creation of even the oil and gas industry, which moved forward society and obviously helped to eradicate poverty and to eradicate or change society for the better. Of course, we know, there is always negatives, and particularly around oil and gas, as we're finding now. But for a long time, there were a lot of positives, and people made a lot of money from that. And people, there seems to be less of a question of whether it's morally right to make money from creating vaccines, for example, as it is for helping to move forward flood defenses, as an example. So it seems to be a little bit sometimes that the clean technology sector is picked on, maybe because of its worthiness, and some people like to always just throw stones at things they don't understand, or that challenges their own way of thinking and their own way of being.
Yeah, I agree.
So it can be, it's certainly a more complex scenario than purely, as you say, addressing the enemy of carbon and carbon emissions. Where have you seen? Because you touched on water, and obviously your early experience in water, which clearly, is an increasingly, fortunately, back on the agenda, both in terms of flooding and flood mitigation and flood defenses, but also just in terms of the usability and the accessibility of drinking water, of course. But where do you see technologies that are ready for investment, which are addressing adaptation more so perhaps than let's say mitigation?
I personally find two fields very interesting. So first, the water aspect. I think desalination is worth a closer look. The technology itself is established, known for many years, but the usage and the business models behind that technology, or on top of that technology, they might be worth to have a closer look at. So whenever I did come to South Europe, either in Spain or south of Italy, I thought, okay, this is very dry land. It's hot. It's getting drier every year, and it's surrounded by so much water. Why doesn't it work that we use desalination and use the fresh water, pump it up in the rural areas, and prevent them basically from desertation? Yeah, I think that's absolutely crucial. And what is missing, I believe, are the business models, and it might also have to do with the price of water. Water might be too cheap, that those business models cannot work. Maybe we need to have a certain price mechanism on the wasting of water. I think that could help as well. So that was the water side. And another thing I personally find very interesting is what can happen or is already happening in the material sciences. Highly reflective coatings, for example, and how they can be used on facades of buildings, on streets, to basically be able to cool down cities in the summer or not getting them too hot.
Yeah. And there's a lot of work, as you say, in around that area of coatings and materials and nanotechnologies, nano coatings and the like, that are able to increase efficiency, or, as you say, increase reflectivity to perhaps hold back some of the excessive heat. But water, as you say, is a challenging one. On one hand, absolutely desalination makes a sense, and I'll come back to that. But of course, we've seen terrible, tragic flooding incidents right there across Europe, and even literally down the road, there were some deaths recently from flooding from a storm even in Liverpool. So it's not just a third world problem, but there must be some work to be done around how we manage water. A lot of the European sewage systems are from decades, if not centuries ago. So there clearly is something that needs to be done there, and maybe a technology can have a part to play there. But it's interesting to business models, because with desalination, often these countries are very high in the resource of solar, of course, which is why they're so dry in the first place. So using solar as a power for desalination seems to be a logical point of view. But as you say, maybe not still having the business model that invites investors to get involved.
Yes. I would like to understand that better, why that is the case. To me, that is not 100% clear. It might go down to the cost for the pipes, for example. I think the pumps are not the problems. Energy is definitely not a problem. It's you could also see it from a different point of view. If such business models do not work in those areas, then the pressure on the people and on the local governments, the pressure is just not big enough. But I assume that will increase over time tremendously.
Yeah. Because that's another interesting point, Ulrich, the fact that a lot of at least for now, obviously it's changing, but for now, many of the climate impacts are felt in poorer areas where there is maybe less money, less business model, even less interest, let's be fair. It seems chronically unfair, but 1,000 deaths in sub-Saharan Africa seems to be far less important or newsworthy than 2 in the UK, for example. So maybe there are some challenges around the fact that who is responsible for some of these issues, because at some point, as you touched on before, there will be probably climate refugees and disruptions to society because of the impacts if we don't address them. But again, I think one of the challenges potentially from an investment perspective or from a technology perspective is whose responsibility and who's paying. And maybe there's an argument that governments need to have more of a say in subsidizing or supporting some of these technologies and business models because of the fairness and justice of it, but also because of the self-interest in that if we don't address these things, then there will be knock-on effects for European and for more developed countries and societies.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there is the idea of a so-called loss and damage fund with the purpose to support poor rural areas which are suffering the most from rising temperatures. I think in general it's a good idea, but it's just the very start. I mean, the idea is basically that a fund is created with money from the Western or the Northern nations to support locally, but it's unclear how this shall then precisely happen. Who is managing that? What are the main value points? Where to invest and what is the expected return? And then the next thing is who should get the return? Shall the return be split? Should it be reinvested? So basically, it's just an idea at the moment, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I think that poses some of the challenge. We know how difficult it is at things like COP to get any consensus or agreement on things which should be relatively straightforward to address, and they're not. And I think this brings back a challenge that if there was this fund, well, I guess there's 2 issues. One of who administers and who gets the rewards. But let's just say, just the creation of this fund. Because if that existed, do you see that there are adaptation technologies that would be able to take advantage of the investment and to have an impact on adaptation if the resources and funds were available to do so?
Yes, I think so. And I believe it's not so complicated from that point of view where you can have a massive impact. And me, it's about a lot about irrigation, because irrigation is... it's basically preventing or protecting the soil and the local agriculture activities. And if people can grow their own food, I think the barrier to migrate is a lot higher than if they can't, because then there is no possibility to stay. Yeah. If they cannot survive, have not enough drinking water, have no water for irrigation for their agricultural activities, I think then you can just run away, and this is the low-hanging fruit here.
Yeah, And particularly given so much of the food that we consume in the northern countries, as you say, are grown or much of it in these areas, which are now borderline as to how long they'll be sustainable as agricultural societies and countries.
Yeah, that's on the one side that is true, but there are also, of course, national protecting mechanisms for our national farmers or local farmers, which make it very difficult for to import goods from Africa, for example.
Right. Yeah. So there's a lot of complexities here around not just the funding, but also the cross-border issues of being able to trade and support countries. And we've seen, certainly in the UK, maybe other countries as well, where there's been a resistance for overseas aid. And effectively, much of this could potentially be seen as overseas aid, even though actually it's in our self-interest to provide it.
Yes, but this was
that's
always the
political
idea of overseas help, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's, again, a challenge for people to understand that actually in helping others, we help ourselves. And we should help others just because it's the right thing to do, but actually it's also a self-interested thing to do as well. Going back to one thing you talked about there, Ulrich, in terms of this potential fund, and it touches on something we spoke about before, about the moral aspect of people making money from climate adaptations. But this could be almost like an evergreen fund or a self-sustaining fund where the profits are largely recycled back into additional projects. And there's enough sovereign wealth funds in the world and enough money in the world to be able to dedicate, I think, a small proportion to adaptation technologies. If we can just accept the fact and start talking about it and just accept the fact that we need to address this topic, we can't just bury our heads in the sand forever about it.
Yeah, it sounds a bit like the Marshall Plan in Germany after the Second World War. Yeah.
That's a really good point, actually. Where there have been examples, and that's obviously a substantial one, where collectively and globally money has been allocated for the best interests of all, and not obviously entirely. I think the US obviously received money back for much of the Marshall Plan, but again, it was an enabler for things to improve, and so there are examples where we have collectively, globally, had that mindset of doing what is the right thing, because, as in the case of the Marshall Plan, the whole of Europe benefited from that, right?
Yeah.
But do you see that as maybe then too big a political challenge, Ulrich? Because, as I say, we see that in evening things like COP and in sort of overseas aid, there's always this complexity and even over semantics of language and terminologies, which impacts where it should be something relatively straightforward to collectively agree on. But how much do you think politics has a role to play in this, bringing to the fore adaptation as a focus area?
Unfortunately, I believe in the southern hemisphere, it is absolutely a political topic, because where it matters most, people have the least amount of capital, and I assume in most situations that makes it very difficult for business models to work. So I think massive political intervention is necessary here. On the other side of the world, in our northern hemisphere, I think we can treat it as we treat the whole climate tech ecosystem at the moment. I think it can be a standalone investment topic for the next decades to come.
Yeah, I was just thinking that because I've always felt that from my 15, 20 years in Cleantech, that we've moved forward as an industry despite, not because of governments. Now, of course, subsidies and policy changes affect big change. We know that. But I think we've always just moved the dial forward in and of ourselves. So in that regard, if you're looking as a potential investor or a fund or an entrepreneur, present day in the European ecosystem, where do you see that there couldn't be opportunities to either deploy that capital or to create technologies in this realm of adaptation Again, we touched on a couple of technologies, but are there particular either countries or mechanisms or areas where you think it's feasible to actually get a return in the sort of in the way the world is at the present time?
Yes, absolutely. I touched on those topics already, but of course I can repeat. I mean, I really believe that great things can be done through new ways of irrigation, especially in south of Europe. So it's not that far away. It's in front of our door. It's vital to prevent dissertation. The preservation of soil is absolutely crucial for food security. Another topic I find very interesting are heat reflecting materials and effective planning of cities and streets. I think currently in all aspects or areas we see some activities going on, but what is overall missing is an ecosystem of entrepreneurs, investors, and governmental support. That's just not there. It's not treated like our climate tech investments seem focused on CO2 reduction.
Yeah, no, that's very true. It's very true. It's such a big and complex topic, and of course, far more that we can address in a short conversation, Ulrich. But the purpose of this was really just to raise that topic, and I know that it's something that you've done previously and have a big interest in. So maybe in closing, it's good to look at again maybe how we as a clean tech ecosystem can at least take this topic of adaptation away from being an unspoken or almost like a taboo subject. I mean, how do you feel that we can start to make this more of at least a conversation publicly?
That's a very good question. I think we need to do what we can to create awareness. On the other hand, climate change itself creates awareness, and it creates the necessity to adapt. I believe it would just be a lot smarter to think ahead and already start and not wait until it gets worse and worse. So I think what we're doing right now is one part of the equation. We're talking about it. We make it public. I'm talking to a lot of funds. I gave a couple of interviews the last weeks. 2 weeks ago, I was speaking with the biggest venture capital magazine in the DACH region about that topic of adaptation. And I think the interest is definitely increasing. And that's a good sign. But to really start to have an impact here, it's also necessary that not only investors think about that topic. The entrepreneurial activity also need to be directed towards that. And it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem. I mean, both has to evolve at the same time, and also at universities. I can imagine chairs to be dedicated for climate adaptation or to climate adaptation, and that's currently not happening. We have that island-like activities, but they need to be combined and directed towards common goals. Yeah.
It's that collaboration. Unfortunately, as a species, we tend to often react too late to many things, as is the case in the climate topic overall. But as with the horrors from the Ukraine war and the subsequent energy price shock has helped in some ways, had some silver linings in terms of moving the dial forward and a greater level of understanding from energy and a renewable element of moving forward. Maybe the disasters that are happening globally because of, in particular, flooding, but wildfires and other things will help to raise. It's a let's be fair, it's a shit way for it to happen, but it raises some awareness that these are topics that we have to address now and we can't delay forever. So hopefully the work that you're doing in talking to these funds and the work that we can do as a community can start to at least create, as you say, an ecosystem where funds start to get interested in the topic, where entrepreneurs start to see opportunities to make an impact in these areas.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, listen, it's been great to share a few thoughts with you, Ulrich. Thanks for being brave enough to raise this topic. I know we've touched on it a few times, and it's not an easy one to address, because you do feel a little bit like you're almost giving up on the bigger picture, which clearly we're not. But the reality is we need to address this adaptation to help those who already are and will continue to be impacted by the changes to the climate. So thank you for the work that you're doing. We'll make sure that we share in the podcast notes links, if you can provide them, to the interviews that we've done recently for some of those publications. And we just invite everybody to reach out to the podcast, to myself, to Ulrich, and start talking about these topics, because we need to focus both on the end goal of carbon reduction, but we also need to address these topics that are starting to really make an impact on our societies, and will continue to do so if we don't address. And hopefully those who watch the podcast believe that technology can't solve every problem, but it can certainly solve a lot of them. And it's great to have people like Ulrich and many investors that we work with who have put their money where their mouths is in terms of bringing forward these technologies. But let's make sure that we can at least have the dialogue around adaptation and start to make an impact there, as well as we say, the bigger CO2 reduction issues that we face. But Ulrich, thanks for being brave enough to join the podcast and sharing your thoughts.
You're very welcome. Thank you.